everyone, and welcome to the HUD OCIO Learning Session. I'm Dr. Melanie Cohen. Today, we're going to be discussing multi-sector leadership in a networked world. Increasingly, achieving results in government requires working across boundaries, whether across internal organizational boundaries or with partners from public, private, or nonprofit sectors of society. Working across these boundaries effectively means identifying the potential obstacles and roadblocks that can keep a multi-sector effort from functioning and finding strategies to overcome these obstacles and roadblocks successfully. This session explores a model that outlines the roles and responsibilities of multi-sector leaders. It also provides a framework for diagnosing whether an issue truly requires a multi-sector approach and how to build and sustain the relationships between and among multi-sector partners, and tools you can apply to immediately use in your own context. We're fortunate to have with us today Dr. Natalie Houghtby-Haddon of the George Washington University Center for Excellence in Public Leadership. Let me introduce our panel, tell you a little bit about Natalie, and then we'll begin our discussion. Today's panel includes Kevin Cook, Deputy Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Thank you for being on our panel today. Dr. Natalie Houghtby-Haddon is the Associate Director of the George Washington University Center for Excellence in Public Leadership and an Associate Professor in the George Washington College of Professional Studies. She teaches leadership theory, ethics, change leadership, and personal development for a number of the Center's leadership development programs. She is also the Academic Program Director for the Center's two graduate programs, the Master of Professional Studies in Public Leadership with a specialization in multi-sector management, and the Graduate Certificate in Organization Performance Improvement. She received a PhD in the Human Sciences from the George Washington University and holds the Doctor of Ministry and the Master of Divinity degrees from the Claremont School of Theology, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Boston University. She is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. So Natalie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Melanie. I appreciate the opportunity to come and to meet with you and to talk about multi-sector leadership and how that's really becoming such a critical and important piece of the way in which we get the work of government done and the way in which we get the work of almost everything done these days. A little bit about the center. Our goal and our mission is to develop public leaders who make a positive difference in their organizations and their communities and the lives of the people that they serve. And I've got some great pictures of some of our folks. And one of the reasons that multi-sector leadership is near and dear to our heart is because we really were started as a public-private partnership between the university and the business and philanthropic communities and the government communities in the district at the time of the control board era long, long ago. So we've had the opportunity to work with the federal sector since then and really look at leadership, work with the organization, the different leadership competencies that are important to federal agencies, and we've discovered that one of the critical pieces is really how can I be a multi-sector leader? And in fact, that's really the question that started it all. It's how do I manage people that I didn't hire and I can't fire? And so it is tough. And so after that, we thought, well, maybe we ought to do some thinking about that. And what we discovered is that in addition to us thinking about that, actually the federal government has been thinking about that a lot as well, too. And GAO did a report recently that said that I think really summarizes it so well, that many of the meaningful results that the government seeks to achieve require the coordinated efforts of more than one federal agency, more than one level of government, more than one sector, whether that's public, private, or nonprofit. And so that's really the way in which we got started, was to try to think through how can we actually help that person who asked that question, as well as improving the communities that really receive the services that the government provides. And these are some of the big issues that we've that require that level of coordination. And so I thought we might talk about one or two of these today, and also just think about what some of the tools and tasks are that can make the mission of the government and the goals of all the participants possible.
Okay. Okay,
Does that
great.
sound like a plan?
Yeah, sounds great.
So some of the drivers that are pushing this include that taxpayers want governments to do more with less, and that's true regardless of what level of government you're in. And one of the ways that we figure out, well, how big is government, is we look at how many full-time employees we have, or full-time equivalents, right? But the reality is that that we may be shrinking the workforce, but in fact, because we're working with other kinds of partners and organizations, that the government is sometimes bigger than we think it is. So learning how to work with those other partners and do that effectively, I think, is a key leadership competency that folks in government need to know. One of the other drivers is that really everything that we do these days really does require either multiple agencies or partners from the private sector or the nonprofit sector to assist. And again, knowing how to do that once you have a contract in place, for example, how do you work with those contractors? How do you make sure that they're producing the work that you need when you can't just go in and be their supervisor and say, you have to do this? And so being more intentional about that, I think, and recognizing that is a critical factor for successful leadership today. And that actually is a part of what GAO has found as well too, that in order to prevent duplication of effort, if agencies can work together more effectively, then government can do its work more effectively.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
Do you think the public or the citizens that receive those services really have an idea of the complexity and the amount of integration between all of these levels? You talked about multi-sector leadership, and maybe just a little bit, explaining a little bit more about that might be
helpful? Okay,
yeah.
sure. Actually, I suspect citizens don't think about that. And, it actually never occurred to me until I moved inside the Beltway, sort of what was involved in making sure that my trash was picked up, making sure that folks, as you saw, folks in my congregations got their Social Security checks, or my parents, or whoever, and that it's. Making sure that people had houses to live in or homes to live in, all of that complexity, both in terms of within sort of how is it that having a healthy, just, and sustainable society, how does that happen? And it is very complex. And so understanding that the federal government needs to work with both state and local governments, but also then those levels of government also have to work with people in local communities and organizations in local communities. All of that together is what we think of as multi-sector leadership.
good.
And if we can even just go back to the map for a second,
Sure.
because when I was doing a little research on this topic, I was thinking about all of the complexities, right? So I was thinking about, you really use multi-sector leadership when you have huge societal problems. And so how do you solve those problems? Now, I think we used to call those wicked problems, and I just saw you call them big, hairy problems,
Yes,
but
right.
it's the same thing.
The same thing,
So
exactly,
you've got
yes.
huge problems that you're trying to solve that really don't have definite solutions.
Right.
You have now 3 sectors who are trying to work together to try to solve those things. You have a demanding society that wants results, right?
Exactly.
And when you are trying to develop these teams of people to work on these things, who is in charge? How do you determine who's in charge of those things? So you've got, I think it's even more complexity now that we're beginning to talk about it than I originally even thought it was, because and you'll get into some of those issues, but I mean, we're not talking about simple things. We're talking about huge societal issues that need results, and they need results fairly quickly, but they need all of the resources. And then that's another issue too. How do you harness all those resources? That's another thing too that is a huge issue here.
It is, yeah. Well, and that's a great question. I mean, who is in charge? I think a lot of it oftentimes government can be the leader in a way because they often bring resources to the table. But I think that's a critical piece of what has to be part of the conversation is who is in charge, or how do we share leadership roles and responsibilities,
Right.
and then and how will we measure results, and even defining the terms. And in fact, to use, for example, one of the interagency efforts that GAO has been looking at is one of the things that HUD is involved with, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and even defining what is homelessness.
Right.
That different agencies that were participating in the effort had different definitions, and so that all of those, figuring out how do we share responsibilities for leadership, what are our roles and responsibilities, where's the money coming from, what's everybody bringing to the table, I think is
Right.
such a critical piece of a successful multi-sector effort.
Right, right, absolutely. It's very complicated.
So let me move through a little bit, and again, we've talked a little bit about what some of the drivers are, and one of the most important recent drivers is the GIPRA Modernization Act that was passed in 2010, and because that actually is mandates that, particularly at the federal level, that there is more cooperation and collaboration across agency boundaries, and then working with other levels of government as well. And so I think that's a terrific framework for why this is important for folks in the federal government in particular to learn more about. And again, we've seen some of these issues are just some of the issues that require multi-sector leadership as well too. So we actually have a definition for what multi-sector leadership is that we use in our master's program that really helps our students and participants to become more effective. And we think of multi-sector leadership as somebody actually acting in a way that inspires partnership and collaboration, and both with individuals and then also with organizations. And usually that's across different sectors: government, business, civil society. But we also have found that often inside a single organization, anytime you're crossing boundaries, these and areas of responsibility, these principles apply, we think. So the other piece that multi-sector leadership does is to create conditions where stakeholders from these different sectors can formally come together to combine their assets in order to achieve a shared goal or objective. And so those are the two pieces that we think really are important for a multi-sector leader to know about, to be able to see, and then also to be able to do effectively.
Right. So the people who are involved need certain skills.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
that's really the key thing.
Yeah.
Not everybody. You may need the multi-sector leadership, and you do to solve big problems, but not everybody in every organization has the proper skills to be able to carry this off.
Right, exactly. Well, and you know, one of the things that I found helpful as I was looking at what GAO has been doing around this is that they found that there were 8 practices that were really helpful in being successful when you're trying to collaborate. So I thought I'd share those because I think they're really great. One is to define and articulate a common outcome. So you know, you don't want to do multi-sector for everything. Sometimes you just want to do what your job is.
Right.
But sometimes, again, where there is a clear outcome that requires more people to come to the table, that you do want to do that. They also found that it was important that particularly in agencies coming together or different organizations coming together, that you need to have mutually reinforcing or joint strategies. So. So homelessness, for example, is a priority for HUD, obviously, but it's also a priority for the VA. It's a priority for Health and Human Services, and the Department of Labor. So you really, in all of those agency missions, eliminating or reducing homelessness is important, and so therefore that's the opportunity to say yes, we can create a strategy that all of us get something from,
Right.
and coming together means that we'll achieve this outcome more effectively. bringing together resources and then agreeing on roles and responsibilities. And Melanie, that's what you were talking about in terms of who actually leads it. You really have to say, well, given this particular facet of it that we're doing, who should be the leader? How do we share leadership responsibility, and really clearly identifying that.
Do you, before you go on, do you see a lot of success in the shared leadership model? Because when you come down to it sometimes, somebody really does need to be in charge. And sometimes when you actually share the leadership, it becomes a little bit ambiguous.
Exactly,
right?
exactly, yeah. Well, and this is where the U.S. Interagency Council that's dealing with homelessness, I think, is an interesting model. So it's established by law, so therefore it does have a formal reason to come together. But part of what they've identified is that there is a chair and a vice chair. Those are elected each year. There are 4 out of the 19 agencies that have primary responsibility for reducing homelessness, and so they share leadership. But and then what's also happening is that the vice chair becomes the chair in the following year. So they're on the one hand clearly identifying when they will have a leadership change, so that one person doesn't get stuck with it forever, but also clear responsibilities about that in order to have sustained success, that somebody will have kind of practice, if you will, doing it and then move into the leadership role, but that it does rotate. So in that sense, that's an example of an interagency collaboration where there is a chair, so there is somebody who is ultimately in that lead role, but that people coming along behind are being sort of developed for taking on that responsibility.
You know, the question that you stated in the beginning of this, how do you deal with people that you didn't hire, you can't fire? I found that matrix management is very tough. So even with this governance model that you've sort of defined there, that's used within this particular organization, do you still see that those kinds of things sort of need to be revisited? An example I was thinking about around the homelessness one again. So there is a joint strategy around eradicating homelessness, but there are different goals perhaps, among the different levels, or people want to focus on something, before another. So which part of the homelessness community is sort of the most targeted? Is it veterans? Is it, women and children? Those kind of things.
Right.
So again, how have you seen those kind of things sort of work themselves out?
Well, I think it actually requires a lot of conversation, and it requires really most successfully it requires a lot of in-person conversation and building of relationships, and then also being intentional about revisiting goals and outcomes. And this is where performance measures are so critical as well too. With a set time period for checking in, because I think that's what helps move things forward. And things change. If there's, for example, if there was some kind of a natural disaster that overlaid what might already be a homeless population, then obviously you've got to have different strategies right in that moment. And so I think that's the key, is being in conversation, building and maintaining relationships, and revisiting priorities and objectives regularly are good strategies for that. And let's see, in fact, GAO agreed with me there. How about that? So, and I think one of the things that, and again, these are things that GAO identified 10 years ago and continue to be critical today, and are in some ways more mandated now that the GIPRA Modernization Act is in place, because they're linked into performance requirements in federal agencies and things like that. So.
It's interesting too, because these things are not easy, right? Even these successful collaboration are not easy, particularly the monitoring and evaluating and the performance pieces.
Yes.
That's not easy. And I think even trying to get shared measures is a little bit difficult among all the participants, because they each have their own stake in the effort,
Right,
right?
right.
So they might not, it might be a little bit more difficult to share the performance, but that's the only way you can actually tell if something's successful. So I think the relationship building piece that you talked about is so critical. And I think that, you know, we talk about relationship building all the time in terms of how do you ever really get anything done anyway.
Right,
It's
right,
through relationship
right,
building.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
that common definition of success, though, if you can come up with something that
Right.
everybody will feel good about and they can go back to their constituents, you know, and sort of saying, we've done a good job on this and we were successful in this particular venture, again, gives you something that everybody can rally sort of around that.
Exactly. It's the WIFM principle, the what's in it for
Absolutely.
me,
Yes,
what's in it for
Right.
us, and how can we make sure that everybody has at least something that they can take back that will sort of move their agenda forward or be an indicator of their performance and success
You know,
as well,
something you talked about, I think you'll cover it a little bit later. I don't want to lose it though, is around the types of people. Melanie, I think you brought up,
Right.
you know, what does it take in terms of skills, leadership abilities, and some of those things that, and I'm sure you teach this within your program, about those things that are going to make you successful in sort of leading these multi-sector
Right,
kind
and
of
we do have
projects.
some
Yeah,
of those
that's
different
something.
leadership capabilities that we think are really key. So these are some of the other things that GAO identified are important for successful collaboration. One is that you do have short and long-term outcomes that have been clearly defined and that people have agreed to. And so I think that's really key. So this goes to the, are we all on the same page in terms of what we're trying to achieve? Accountability, how are you going to track and monitor progress? And then again, this leadership piece is so critical. How do you identify what roles you need, who's got what responsibilities, and again, what are the accountability factors in each of those, and have we agreed on them? And then resources. And this is one of the tough parts in the federal government is that unless an interagency activity is explicitly funded by Congress, you can't use appropriated dollars for it. And so again, this is one of the reasons that the Interagency Council on Homelessness has been successful, is because actually funding is appropriated for it each year. And so it really has a lot of the infrastructure that can make it successful. And so one of the challenges with other kinds of collaborative efforts is that you don't always have that infrastructure in place that is, you know, the legal requirement, the funding requirement, and so on.
So one of the things that's been I've been in HUD about 5 years now, previously worked at Energy, both do a lot of grants, but I think again the availability of funding through grants is one, but not so defined as
Right.
this is,
Yes.
which makes this kind of a special.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, but in but you mentioned grants, particularly grants that go down through local, state and local government. One of our students in our master's program was in a Florida county, and she had responsibility for the energy assistance for low-income people, and they had not been able to use the grant fully and effectively, and so one of her projects for one of her classes actually was to identify what was going wrong in the process and to try to improve the ability of both the county and the federal government and so on to get resources to the families that needed it in a more timely fashion.
Was that a staffing issue, or just the administration of the grants was difficult, or?
That was one piece of it. That working with the utility was an issue. Just the number of people who had to sign off on things. So they were able to reduce the time it took for a family to receive assistance from 11 days to 1 day. So we think about that as one of our real
Great
successes.
success.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you one other question before you move on?
Sure.
When you're talking about, I keep going back to performance because I
Right,
kind of have
right.
performance on my mind because that's how you actually assess whether it's working or
Yeah.
not. Are you also assessing the performance of the leaders? And how do you do that?
Well, that's a that's a tricky subject. I think you need to, and what we do in our leadership development programs is we invite people to both take formal 360s, for example,
Okay.
where you get that kind of information, but also to do it in a more informal way as well too. And there's a couple of sort of almost basically three questions. So how are we doing? What could we do better? And what do I need to do more, better, or differently to help us be successful?
Okay.
And if you sort of ask those as an informal set of assessment questions, it can be, I think, a helpful way to sort of say, am I really sort of leading in a way that's moving us forward?
So you're assessing the effort. The reason I ask is because sometimes the effort can't go forward if the leadership's not there.
Right, exactly.
So you would have to assess the leadership periodically through the process.
Right,
so I was
exactly.
just wondering how you did that.
Yeah.
But in laying out the critical sort of factors for success for the program, in some ways that would force you into some leadership lessons as well, right? Because if those things aren't working, you don't have the right kind of people, is it a resource issue, is it strategy, and those kind of things. So I think you back yourself into some performance outcomes on the leadership as well based on whether the programs
Being
are successful.
Right,
yeah.
right. It does take, a willingness on the part of the people who are involved to sort of take a look at themselves.
Right,
And say,
that's what I'm thinking. That doesn't happen every day. I
Yeah,
mean, because
yeah.
even if you look in organizations,
Right.
without a multi-sector sort of, or even a interagency kind of thing, you don't often do the assessment of the leader. It's usually the program.
Right, exactly.
And so I was just wondering
Yeah,
if that was
yeah,
built into
yeah.
this process.
Well, I think that's where the sort of looking at these four pieces together, the outcomes are obviously the key because that
Yeah.
gives you
Right.
what you're trying to achieve. And then if you look at the leadership piece, then if you've got the roles and responsibilities clearly identified and agreed upon, it's always good to come back and sort of check in periodically and say, is that still the case? Did we actually assign responsibilities appropriately?
Right.
And do we have the right people in the roles and so on? So I think that's it is important to think of this as a regular piece, a check-in piece that is, I think, a useful way to think about what is the leadership? Is it actually effective for what we're trying to achieve?
Right.
And do we have
I
the
would
right
think
person?
even more critical in this multi-sector too, because a lot of factors are outside of your control. So
Right.
some of those negotiation, collaboration skills might be really, sort of
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, those are the building coalitions, leadership skills that are a part of OPM's executive core qualifications are some of the ones that we think are really critical. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Speaking of responsibilities, Melanie, we actually have 5 that we think are critical when you are working in a multi-sector situation. And the first is to assess the context and the stakeholders. So what is it that we're trying to achieve? Is it something that I and my organization can achieve all on my own, or do I need to bring other people to the table? And in those other people, what might their roles and what might their desires be as well too? And so first to assess the context, the stakeholders, do I have all of the stakeholders identified? And then to do what we call identify the potential sources of noise. In other words, what are the agendas of the people who are coming to the table of those stakeholders? And are there agendas that are so critical for them that might actually stop our ability or hinder our ability to work together collaboratively? And is there some way that then I can address that by being explicit about it, by working with one particular organization on the side or one particular stakeholder on the side to say, if we are able to work together on this effectively, then this may help you do this other piece. And so, again, to try to see how can we make it a win for everybody. And then if you're able to do that, to make sure that all the stakeholders have a piece of the action, see what's important for them, that you've clearly identified what you're hoping to achieve, then to work and to work to inspire loyalty to that shared goal, to that shared ideals and purpose. And I was looking at an article recently about different perspectives that leaders can bring to the table. And one of the pieces is sort of symbolism, and that leadership requires an ability to talk about or to take advantage of the ideals, the values, et cetera, the symbols that are important, so that we remember why it is that we're doing it. You know, what's important about making sure that people aren't living on the street and have a roof over their head, for example, and why do we as a society think that's an important thing, and what about dignity and so on. And if we're able to accomplish this, then and work together, then we'll be able to make sure that the people that we serve are in a better place and are able to live a better life.
It's great motivation for public service.
Exactly, exactly. And so out of that, to mobilize the group to really create and achieve an extraordinary achievement. So those are we think the 5 areas of responsibility that a multi-sector leader has. But you know, it's not easy, as we've been talking about, and so
absolutely not.
We were able to come up with a set of 16 questions, and again, these come out of our master's program, but we think they really we're implementing them in all of the leadership development work that we do, and and there are 8 questions that deal with the issue, which help you really define if the issue is a multi-sector or would require a multi-sector approach, and then how to build the relationships. And we talked earlier about how important the relationships are. So, and I know this is a little bit small in a way, but in understanding the issue, you really want to say, what is the real issue that we're trying to deal with, and why and how is this a multi-sector issue, as opposed to just something that we need to do maybe more effectively internally, but do we really need to bring different partners to the table? And again, looking at why should people or organizations in other sectors care about what this issue is, and what kind of leader does it take to make an impact on the issue? And so do we need somebody who's really directive? Do we need somebody who is really collaborative in their approach and who can bring different parties together? Do you need somebody who is, you know, a great visionary who can really paint the picture for why achieving the outcomes will make society better? And so if you're one of those people who's thinking about, you know, am I that leader? Am I the right leader? Am I willing to work with other people who may have other skills, other capabilities that I don't have? How can I bring a leadership team to the table, for example, that would help us be successful? So really thinking through the issue itself, what it is, why it's a multi-sector issue, if it is, and then what kind of leadership will be necessary to move it forward. And so then that brings you over to the relationships and what's important about that as well too. And so one of the things is to think about what are the things that we would need to line up ahead of time in order to make our work together successful. So have we identified all the stakeholders? Have we figured out what benefits will come to all of the stakeholders? And so how can everybody get something that's important to them out of the work together? What are the resources that we are going to need to bring together? Who's going to provide them? How do we make sure that that's shared as evenly as possible or as fairly as possible? And are there pieces that we're missing in our collaboration, and is there somebody else that we need to bring into the table in order to make sure that we have something, that particular thing covered? So, and then again, to go back to what are the measurable results and outcomes that we expect if we do in fact engage in collective action?
You know, it's interesting, as you're talking, I know we're talking about multi-sector leadership and we're talking about societal issues, but what we're really talking about at the very base, I think, is problem solving.
Right? Exactly.
And so I think that these questions are fantastic because I think what we can do is we can modify these questions a little bit to use for everyday problem solving in our organization.
Exactly.
Right? Because in our organizations, generally, the problem doesn't exist within our own little group. It's an organizational problem that needs other people, right? So we can even use some of these things for our own purposes in our organization to make changes.
Exactly.
You know, that's why when I first saw these, I thought these are great. You know, it's hard to solve, you know, homelessness and hunger and, you know, huge health issues, but without these kind of all these people playing together. But if we can just use this in our own little teams, you know, we might be able to solve our own smaller problems in a much easier way.
Right.
This is a great takeaway.
Yeah. So, and that's what we really have found is it's so adaptable for different situations, because you know it's really people who come together to solve problems, and so regardless of whether it's just inside our own organization or just with a particular group that we're working with, it doesn't have to be a huge multi-sector issue to use these questions. So, and I want to really celebrate Dr. A.J. Robinson, who teaches our Mastering Multi-Sector Leadership class, who's the person who thought up these questions as a way to move our master students forward, and they have found them to be very, very helpful in all the work that they're doing. They're mostly mid-career professionals in different levels of government, and so they found this to be very helpful.
Right, because this can help you solve problems in a new way, instead of the old problem-solving method, which is just like, I have the problem, I come up with the solution, and let's see what happens. You know, this actually gives you much more concrete things to think about.
So it greatly defines the problem a lot better. I think it forces you to think strategically, sort of about the whole thing. I did have the question. One of the things you talked about earlier was accountability, and I see some performance outcomes, but I don't necessarily see something specific around that. And I think about that a lot, not just in our agency issues, but in the multi-sector, because again, we're accountable to the public who's supposed to receive these services, who's paying them for them through you know, taxes. But also, when you look back at if something doesn't happen or if the success factors aren't sort of reached, you know, then sort of who's accountable. And one of the things that's interesting, especially in the multi-sector, is a lot of time the public holds the federal government, you know, as the ultimate, you know, accountability on that. Whereas a lot of times there are multiple people, again, like you talked about before, who are involved in the actual delivery. Through the states, local governments, even down to community partners who may be on the receiving end of grants or monies that are identified specifically for that. And so, again, using that as one of the things that also would be a forcing mechanism, I think, for people to work together. How do you work that into sort of the relationships and the issues? I mean, do you think about that sort of on the back? You're hopeful everything's going to be great, right? So
wonderful,
but in the event, you know, that it doesn't, and we get concerned about those kind of things, HUD, because they are political big P and small p issues around whether a service provider is successful or not, and then those things, you know, sort of come back to HUD.
Well, I think that really goes to on the relationship. Sort of question 10: what are the tasks that need to get done before action can occur? I think, and then also the number 16: what are the measurable results and outcomes? That you really have to be explicit, I think, and trying to figure out how are we going to measure that, and it is hard because a lot of what is important is hard to measure, and you don't want to let the ability to, you know, we you know, had X number of people come through our doors is one measure, but did something happen with those people that actually made a difference?
They received a good service.
Exactly. So I think that it is the ongoing challenge of performance measurement, is how do you take what are sometimes very intangible things and make them things that you can count. So.
Well, it's difficult because, again, we're talking about societal problems. Right? So we're talking about homelessness. We're talking about availability of health care. We're talking about climate. We're talking about a lot of different things that don't have the obvious measures, I think, that we normally think about when we think about performance measures, which is much more tangible.
Right?
So it's kind of how do you... sometimes you have to qualify it in some way, right? You don't have quantifiable numbers to assess. But if you can assess, you know, change in living environment or, you know, greater educational opportunities or something, then you can actually see. But I think the part about the measurable results, actually coming up with what those would be that makes sense to all the sectors, and that they each can play a part in it's probably not easy either.
No. But it is, I think, when you're,
so
but it's very
important.
important, and,
Right.
and to really be intentional as you get started on something like this. We often use the logic model as a tool, and we use it sort of both moving forward and coming backward. So if you, so if you're looking at what are we going to need, I mean, what's the outcome that we want to achieve, and then you sort of step it back. How will we know we've done that, and then what is it going to take to make those things happen that will lead to that? And so we find that that's a really valuable tool to just even sketch it out, and there's another set of questions. Oakley and Krug came up with these 5 questions for leading change, but just for doing things. And the kind of the summary is, as we look at this, what's working for us, and then what might we need to do more, better, or differently to get closer to our goal. And just even if you just are constantly asking those 2 questions, what are we doing well, and then what do we need to do more, better, or differently to get closer to our objective, is a helpful way to sort of stop and pause and take a look at things and say, this is working really well. Can we leverage that? This isn't working so well. Can we? What might we do differently in order to make that thing more effective?
Right.
And to just work that in at regular points.
That's excellent.
So we just see, and again, we talked about leadership competencies, and OPM has identified executive core qualifications that are important for all leaders in the federal government, and we think they're great leadership competencies for anybody in any organization. But this one about building coalitions is really key, and it's got 3 sort of sub practices or competencies. The first is partnering, and these are good kind of things that you need to do. You need to figure out developing a network, building alliances, collaborating across boundaries, being politically savvy. So those internal and external politics that might get in your way. I didn't realize this was so-and-so's favorite project that I'm suggesting isn't working well, so why don't we kill it?
Right.
So that could be a big challenge. So to be aware of those kinds of things. And then influencing and negotiating, and I think this is one of the ones that requires a lot of practice, but is so critically important. How can I persuade you that if we work together in this way and do these things together, that we'll be able to achieve these outcomes, and that will be important? And to look at, how can I help understand what you are needing and desiring and hoping will happen, and how can I really hear that in a way that I can see, well, maybe something that I'm doing I could do differently that would help you get that even more effectively.
Win-win is sort of an overused sort of term there, but definitely works. In terms of everybody finding. So what's in it for us versus what's in it for me.
Yeah. Exactly. That's a great way to put it. So. And these are some other ones that we've come up as well too. That you really have to understand the enterprise. What is the larger things? It's not. My office has this piece of it, but as we look at sort of what everybody needs to do, how am I aware of what my piece either going well or not going well? What will be the cascading effects that? In terms of who and what else will be impacted if we don't do it well, and if we do. Again, net-centric, we talked about this being multi-sector leadership in a network world. How do you really meet people in other agencies, how do you build those relationships?
Right.
How do you just pick up the phone and say, Melanie, I'm having an issue with this, and I know that you have some expertise in this. Could you just do a little brainstorming with me? Would that be possible? So it really is about the personal, and again, this is where relationship is so critical. And then again, leading without formal authority goes back to our question: how do I lead people or manage people that I didn't hire, can't fire? So, really, I think the relationship piece of that is so critical to really understand the people that you're working with, to know what makes them tick, to say, how can I help you help yourself, and in that help me. And then finally being able to connect the dots to see how, again, what I do has an impact on what you do, and what you do has an impact on this person, and oh, by the way, that person has a dramatic impact on what I do. So if I can help you be successful and help that which then helps that person be successful, then that can come around and help me be successful.
As an IT guy, I love the analogies here. I'm certainly, enterprise, net,
Yes.
systems.
Right.
Golly, I wonder where we came up with all those terms.
Right. Certainly have to use these.
Exactly. So it really is that is the metaphor, right? We're all networked, those little nodes in the
Right,
enterprise.
it's that whole
The
idea
picture, I'm
of
loving it.
the interdependence.
Exactly.
It's really the idea of the network.
Exactly.
Like no one is an island.
Exactly.
Right? So
Exactly.
everybody needs
It's all
each other.
connected.
And I think
Absolutely.
until people realize that they're not islands, that they do need each other, that's when this whole effort really can work.
Exactly.
I think that's why it's so important to talk about those partnerships. Again, one of the questions I raised earlier is, does the public really sort of realize all of the players that are in these? And again, sort of understanding that, not as an excuse, but certainly helps with the complexity in terms of the delivery of service. It takes a little bit longer to come up with strategies and that kind of thing versus just being able to go to this one place, downtown, so to speak, and pick up those things. But it is complex.
Yeah. Exactly. So.
Have you found that this works maybe a little smoother on a smaller scale, like if we don't talk about the federal government, if we just talk about local government? Do you find that that's a little bit of a smoother process?
Well, people are still involved.
Right. No, I know that. No, I know.
I mean, I think it's certainly easier to find the people and build relationships. I
Right.
think when you're talking about a smaller
Right.
thing. I mean, we talk about HUD, and then we're
Right.
talking about Health and Human Services, and we're
Right.
talking. You've got
Right.
huge organizations and so on. So how do we focus on an issue? Say like homelessness. Now, one of our other students, I mentioned one who was dealing with an energy issue in her local jurisdiction. We have another alum who is in the Washington state area dealing with veterans homelessness in particular, and she was very much involved in their work in the past year to try to achieve the mayor's challenge of reducing or eliminating homelessness. But she found it was very much she had to work with both different levels of government, federal, state, and local.
Right.
And the city as well too. She had to work with different community partners and so on, and that it really, on the one hand, knowing the people, being able to sort of bring people together into the room to be able to talk about the issue was easier in some ways, but there's still the same issues that you need to deal with about, are we sure that people are seeing that they're getting value from participating in it, that the solutions that we're coming up with are not overly burdensome or are creating new problems that we hadn't thought about, and all those kinds of things. So I think it's easier to be to see it as sort of more personal in a way at a local government, because you've literally got people walking in the door that you're trying to help, which I think at the federal government you don't always realize sort of what's the face of the person who's coming in to receive our services.
We have those conversations about being in wholesale business versus retail. And an interesting example, but again, that King County, Seattle area is a very dynamic area, but there's still a lot of folks, because even the city, county, there's a little bit of competition among those jurisdictions. But I think, again, sort of understanding the difference between being on the ground, sort of delivering those services makes a big difference. And you're talking about the local communities. And so again, it's visible because it's right there in your face. It's, not sort of here where it's this thing that's far away, that you're involved in.
Yeah, exactly. But
Let me ask one other thing, because I'm thinking maybe for the audience who's listening. So it's pretty clear that the public and nonprofit, what their roles would be, because they're very similar roles in a way, okay, because those are societal issues.
Right.
The private sector, their involvement, I'm thinking, is a little different, because they're market-based normally. But is that because of the sustainability issues that private sector is more involved now in these kind of issues, or what is the private sector role exactly?
Well, I think obviously it depends on the issue specifically, but again, if we're thinking about the issue of homelessness, for example, which has been kind of our test case all the way along today. Having people who can have jobs. We discovered here in the region, one of our other leadership programs looked at homelessness in the region, and what they realized is that a lot of working people actually are homeless. They live in their cars, et cetera. And so am I getting the best out of my workers if they actually are having to kind of scramble to be able to be, have clothes that are clean and food to eat and so on, to come in and really bring their best to me. So to some extent, it's in my best interest to have workers that have homes or some kind of housing that they can, so that they're not out on the street. But then also, if I'm a developer and thinking about housing issues, why should I do affordable housing as opposed to market rate housing?
Right.
And so again, what's in it for me if I have some units that are affordable? What are the incentives for me, and so on? So I think in that sense, there are different kinds of ways that the private sector is important in terms of really supporting or leveraging, and then over time, being able to sustain down the road.
Right. I was just thinking for the audience. I mean, I could think of examples too in healthcare. It's the private sector that gets the vaccines to market.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
But it's the public sector that's actually identifying the crisis and
right. Or
and
oftentimes it's the particularly again at the federal level, it's so critical, providing money for basic research or some of those things that it's not economically feasible for the private sector to be able to do. That's one of the reasons that partnering together can be so critical.
Those are reasons government is in the business of many of those things, because coming up with those sort of by themselves, it might not be feasible or profitable. Using an example you talked about with the different types of housing in one development, and so while it might be part of their community efforts to provide some of those. But, to be honest, developers in the business sort of making money. But again, if they're getting reduced tax burdens or, something like that, that's an incentive to do that, along with knowing that there's a need for both market rate as well as cut rate, sort of housing.
Yeah.
But there's, many examples. I think the medicines are a great example in terms of sort of focusing on those, and eventually things sort of catch up between the private market like the pharmaceuticals, the research entities like the universities. But again, you sort of come out with this good thing, but they get an incentive too. For X amount of years, they get to claim the full patent on that before it goes generic.
Yeah. Right.
But again, on the front end, if there's not some incentive perhaps from the government to do that, if they can't see a means, then it's maybe, be honest, it's not in their best interest.
Right, exactly,
as a corporation.
exactly. So I think that's why it's really so important for all the sectors to really work together to achieve these important societal goals that we have.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, and again, we've been using this as our case example a lot today. And so one of the things that I thought was really interesting about it is that it was established by law. It's been around since 1987. There are 19 different departments and agencies, and then that it is funded by Congress. And so it really does make it possible for this particular interagency effort to be successful, because there's staff and so on that can be hired, which other ones are more challenging if there's not appropriated dollars, because agencies can't share unless they can link it to their agency goals and priorities. Correct. And so that's one of the, we've talked a lot today about how the partners come together in terms of identifying mutually shared goals and objectives. And that's really critical when you're looking at funding issues that will be able to sustain the effort. So, but I thought it was good to see some of the results that were listed. That the GAO found is that in the last, between 2010 and 2013, that chronic homelessness was reduced by about 15%, and that veteran homelessness was reduced by about 24%. Again, that's certainly with the big effort to reduce that even further by the end of 2015 was key.
It's awesome to be been a part of this. I mean,
Yeah.
the hard fact is something,
Right.
you know, we worked on personally in our office. So
Right,
that's
exactly.
pretty good to see
Yeah,
that.
Exactly.
so that's really exciting.
So we don't have that much more time, Natalie.
Okay.
So but I think this has been great, though, because I don't think a lot of people think about the interconnectedness of public-private nonprofit. I think people sort of are in their own, you know, kind of in their own tunnel,
Yes.
or something, silo
Yes,
or whatever. So for the audience watching, if you could leave them with just a couple of key points that they can take back to their desk, I mean, take back to their office right after the session and start implementing right away, what would those things be?
Well, I would. Part of what I would do is I would look at those 16 questions.
Right.
I would make those my own, but I think it's so important to think about who are the people involved. What is it that they want and what they need out of an effort that we work on together? And what can I do to help them achieve that so that I can achieve what I need to do as well, too? And just to remember that we're often much better together than we are on our own.
That, you know, those are very wise words, actually. That's something I think we all need to remember a little bit more. So, thank you very much for being with us, and please join us again next month for the HUD OCIO Learning Session. Have a wonderful day.